We'll wait for a few people to just to pop in and we'll start. I haven't really, because this is like off the fly, so I haven't. I'll share the stream to Facebook and YouTube. It's streaming on Facebook, both my Facebook pages, Confident Faith, my personal, and the YouTube.
All right.
So yes,
yeah, I could share the link on my page too after this is over. So we'll hopefully get you some more views.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I'll send it in some group chats with all my friends, just so we don't start in vain. All right, let's just go ahead and start. So we got one viewer. So welcome to Confident Faith. This whole channel, everything we're doing here is to think through what we believe and show that we can have confidence in our faith. We don't have to, fits perfectly with this topic. We're talking about epistemology, and epistemology is essential, I think, to knowing what we believe and knowing we can have confidence in what we believe. So that is why I have the man himself, David Pallman, joining us. His bread and butter is epistemology, in my opinion. I met David online. Me and him have similar backgrounds, so that's great. He's very well learned on this topic. So I'll go ahead and let David give a quick introduction. I don't want to butcher it, so go ahead and let David give his introduction.
Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction you did give. I hope I'm not a letdown to everyone now after you build me up like that. But yeah, I have my own Apologetics YouTube channel. It's called Faith Because of Reason. So people who are interested in epistemology or apologetics more generally can check out my work there. And I also occasionally write articles for Tim Stratton, his website, Free Thinking Ministries. So if anyone's interested in my written work, you can see it there. But yeah, I'm pretty boring other than that.
Okay, so I'm sure most of my viewers are probably wondering what epistemology is in general. So before we start, I think it's good for you to define what epistemology even is. So go ahead and do that.
Yeah, sometimes it sounds like a bad word to people. They're like, "Oh, good. What is that? Does that have something to do with the bathroom?" So no. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So it's one of the three major branches of philosophy. So philosophy is pretty broad. You can break it down kind of into ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. And epistemology deals with knowledge, and so everything that's related to that is under discussion there. And I don't know if you want me to give a quick definition of knowledge, because that.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you can go to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a little bit controversial. What should we even think of it? But kind of a working definition would be justified true belief, and something that kind of makes sense of that is just if you kind of think through each of those three elements, right? For example, if you don't believe something, then it seems like you don't know it, right? I can't know something while not believing it. And then it seems like it's also got to be true, right? I can't know something which turns out to be false. If it turns out to be false, we would say, oh, well, I didn't know that. And then it seems like it's not enough to just have a true belief, because, let's say I'm picking beliefs out of a hat, right? And I just happen to pick out the belief that I'm going to get a raise tomorrow at work. And then it turns out, oh, I really did get a raise tomorrow at work. We wouldn't say I really knew that, though, right? Because I got lucky. So It seems like you've also got to have some kind of good reason for thinking the belief is true. So that's why all three of those elements of the definition are important. You need a belief that is true, it matches reality, and you've got a justification or a reason for thinking that it's true.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I like when I first was learning about it, which I'm still learning about it. That's why I'm having David come on, because he's a good help in this. But it seemed like, at first it seemed to me, I can know something and it ends up not being true at first. Which, as we go into, like the example is, maybe I think I know something, which now I'm saying I think I know, but which that entails that I didn't know. But let's say I thought I knew something was happening. I believed that it was true, whatever. And I would think I have knowledge, and you don't realize it. But after the fact, talking about it, I would say, well, I thought I knew, and that kind of clicked with me. I'm like, okay, so you don't actually have knowledge, and that's just a justified true belief. Is that pretty standard, like as far as like among multiple philosophers on what knowledge is, or is there a debate among what knowledge is? Which I'm sure there is, but
That was pretty standard from about the time of Plato, so way back when, up until 1963. So up
Mm.
until 1963, that was pretty much the accepted definition of knowledge. In 1963, this guy by the name of Edmund Gettier came along, and you've probably heard of the Gettier problem. And basically, that's a problem that tries to show that, oh, well, it looks like there are some cases where we could have a justified true belief, but still not have knowledge. An example of this might be if you think of yourself at the airport, right, and you're waiting for your flight, and so you look over at the clock to see what time it is, and the clock says it's 10:30, and it really is 10:30. Well, it seems like you've got a justified true belief, but then you check the clock again in another 20 minutes, and it still says it's 10:30. Well, then you realize the clock is broken. But because it really was 10:30, when you looked the first time, it seems like you had a justified true belief.
Mm.
But we don't really want to say you knew that, right? So that has actually opened up a debate then over maybe we have to add a fourth condition to knowledge. My own position is actually that the original definition of justified true belief is adequate and we can overcome problems like that. But it's not widely accepted or as widely accepted now as it has been for most of history.
So what are like most of the responses to the Gettier problem? Like, what have been some responses that you've heard to, like, as far as like, well, that, yes, like that's an interesting, point, but we still, justified true belief still gets us knowledge. Like, what have been the major responses to the Gettier problem?
Yeah, so there's kind of three responses out there to it. So one is to kind of just throw out justification, say that that's a problem, so you don't actually need justification for your belief to be to count as knowledge. And so there's kind of a search out there to add a different third condition. So you take out justification, and somebody like Alvin Plantinga will want to say, well, let's make it warrant instead. So it's not justified true belief, it's warranted true belief. And for him, a warranted belief is a belief that kind of comes about through a reliable process. So it's not something that you're going to have any kind of access to, right? Like you wouldn't have a way of knowing that the process is reliable, but kind of objectively, as long as your beliefs come about through a reliable process and there's not any defeater, not any reason for thinking that it's false, then Plantinga thinks that you can call that knowledge. So he would say it's a warranted true belief, and he thinks that gets him out of the Gettier problem. Now, that's also controversial. I don't think that does get him out of the problem, but that's one kind of response you can take. Another one is to add a fourth condition on the knowledge. So it's justified true belief and something else. One of my friends, Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, suggests like carefulness. So she said it should be a justified true belief that you've been careful about, and so she thinks that can get her out of the Gettier problem. I think that's fine, but I don't think we actually have to do that, because my own response would be to make a distinction between two different kinds of justification, right? So if we think about justification, it's like a reason for thinking something is true, right? And so maybe think like premises in an argument, right? Like probably most of your viewers would know like the Kalam cosmological argument, right? So you've got premises like whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And you say those premises are the justification for the conclusion that the universe has a cause. Now, there can be kind of two different ways of thinking about the justification here then. So there's kind of a type 1 justification, and that's a justification it's just a reason for thinking that something is true. But then there's also a type 2 justification, which is I would want to say it's having true premises. So they're both reasons for thinking something is true, but the second type of justification insists that you've got to have true reasons that you're inferring the belief from. Now, Gettier problems, because like every example you can give, like the one that I just gave of the clock, it always involves getting a true belief from a false premise, right? Like in the case of inferring that it was 10:30, it was a true belief, but the clock wasn't working. So you got a true belief from a false premise. So that would be a type 1 justification. You have a reason for thinking it's true, but turns out the reason is false. So if we insist that our reasons have to be true reasons, that'll get us out of the Gettier problem, because get to your problems, they always involve getting a true conclusion from a false premise. So if we just insist that you have to have true premises, then the problem, it disappears. So that's my own solution to the problem. But, you could also look at maybe adding a fourth condition or something like that. So I hope that wasn't too technical, but that's the essence of it.
One thing I'll ask just before we get too into it is why is asking the question, how do we even know what we know? Like, why is engaging in epistemology worthwhile? Like, why is it seen as a virtue?
Yeah, and a lot of people, it does seem kind of like an abstract and formidable thing of, do we really have to go there? And the funny thing is you can actually get a long way without, going there. If you just start talking about like maybe scientific or historical issues, then maybe to some extent you're not going to have to go to epistemology if you're okay with working with the basic assumptions that are of those fields, right? Mm-hmm. So in science, like you're using inductive reasoning, right? You're making inferences from classes or to whole classes from samples, things like that. And so if you're okay with just making that assumption, you'll be able to do science. But what if someone comes along and says, oh, but I don't think inductive reasoning is valid? Well, then you're going to have to go to epistemology because induction it's an assumption within science. So pretty much you can get quite a long ways without going there as long as you're willing to work with common assumptions. But as soon as assumptions come under threat, then if any of your scientific beliefs, you wanted those to be justified, then you're going to have to, again, make sure that induction is actually a valid means of gaining knowledge. So kind of to me, it gives me like an intellectual assurance to know that I could just trace my beliefs down to the ground level. A person who's okay with they just don't want to go there and they just assume that that's all good. Mm-hmm. If someone's okay with doing that, then, there's not a lot I can say to change that person's mind. But if you kind of want the personal assurance that you can go straight down to the bottom and your beliefs are justified, then I think that there is a lot of motivation for looking into the issue. And especially for us as Christians and Christian apologists in particular, because apologetics is about giving a justification for the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And by adding justification there, that immediately links us to epistemology, because epistemology deals with the question of justification. So, there's a debate among Christians about how should we justify our faith to unbelievers? How is it that we should go about giving a defense of the faith? And so, you've got presuppositionalists, evidentialists, classical, cumulative case apologists. You've got all these different ways of doing it. And what that is those are all different outworkings of different epistemologies. So as Christians who want to defend our faith, we want to do a good job at that. And so if we want to do a good job of justifying our faith, then we want to be competent in the question of how is it that justification should happen. So I think at least for us as Christians, we've got a really good reason to study epistemology, because if we're going to be trying to justify our Christian belief to others, then we need to know, what it means for a belief to be justified.
And one thing you said, just you mentioned something, and I think that might be a good route we can go, is you mentioned about how if you were to justify your beliefs, you would have to, you could have that option of tracing down your beliefs down to a base level. So where does that, I know there's foundationalism and all that different stuff. So what's your particular view about what grounds knowledge? And we can maybe talk about that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So sometimes the whole motivation for epistemology in the first place, kind of where it begins, I think, is when you start asking the question why. So say, I believe that God exists, and someone says, well, why? Because I think the universe began to exist and God is the best explanation. Well, why? We've got evidence that the universe began to exist. How do you know about that? So it's kind of, you start asking all these why questions.
Yeah.
And it seems like the questions can just go on and on and on. And eventually you're kind of like, well, does it ever end? Where does this chain stop? And this is kind of what's known as the regress problem. It's a famous problem. It goes way back to the ancient Greek philosophers. They dealt with it. And so what our options look like is that this chain either just goes back forever, it goes in a circle, or it stops somewhere. And those seem like the only three options. And so, you do have philosophers known as infinitists who will try to say that chain actually does go back forever. There are problems with that because we can't have an infinite number of beliefs, right? So first, there's no way to know that this infinite chain is really there, right? Maybe there's not an infinite chain of beliefs. We wouldn't be able to know. Even if there is an infinite chain of beliefs, we can't possibly have them all. So it seems like even if the infinity is there, it's not going to help us to justify our beliefs. You could say it goes in a circle, but then you got problems with circular reasoning. So the only satisfying answer does seem to be that chain ends somewhere. And so philosophers will talk about a basic belief or a properly basic belief. And what they mean by that is a belief where that chain is a place where it ends. So it's a belief that you're justified in holding, but not because of any other beliefs. So then there's a debate over, okay, well, if you take that solution to the regress problem, then how is that most basic belief of all, how is it justified if it's not by another belief, right? And so, of course, there's a whole bunch of options there. But I would, say it's in a direct kind of awareness, right? So I see like a blue book on the shelf, over there in front of me. So I would say that the belief that I see it is justified by my awareness of it. And so notice I'm not appealing to another belief at that point, right? I'm just appealing to an awareness. So there's not any question of, well, what justifies that awareness? Well, awareness can't be true or false, right? Awareness, it's either there or it's not. And so awareness kind of puts me in a position to know things. And so that's kind of where I want to appeal as the foundations, at least of our empirical beliefs about the physical world. It's in our direct awareness of these sorts of things. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Also, while we're talking about that, you were talking about how it's beneficial for Christians to engage in epistemology because the whole point, apologists, as well as Christians in general, it's a call for everyone to give an answer, right? Which is giving a justification for what we believe. What's we kind of talked about why that's important, but what's a way that we can practically do that? So let's say you're talking to someone, and you said, I believe there's a God, and like you're saying, well, they say, well, why do you believe it's a God? And you say, well, where do you go from there?
Yeah,
I know there's many options, and there's many different, but what's a practical way, or what's should just kind of allude to that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the kind of argument that you're giving. So normally we're using God as an explanation for something, and we want to say that God is the best explanation. Now, when we're assessing explanations for data, there are various criterion that we have for determining, what's a best explanation. So some of these include a simpler explanation is better than a more complicated explanation. And you could say, why is that? Why is a simpler explanation better? And I think the answer is that there are just fewer ways for it to go wrong, right? Because I'm packing less into this explanation. So maybe an example of this would be, suppose you have a stack of $1 bills, right? You've got 100 of them, and you've got $1 bills, and you leave them all on your dresser, and you come home from work, and they're all gone. Well, you have the explanation. Oh, yeah, and let's say the window's open as well. So you've got the option that one guy opened the window and took the $100, right? Or maybe 100 different guys all opened it, one after the other, and each only took $1. Well, one explanation is a lot simpler than the other one, right? That only one guy did it. And so we say that's the better explanation because there's fewer ways that explanation can go wrong, right? Because if there were only 99 instead of 100, then the explanation that there are 100 burglars who stole $100, then it can go wrong in 99 different ways. So simplicity, that's a good one. Explanatory power is another thing, right? The simplest explanation of all would be that nothing exists. That's the simplest hypothesis out there. but it's obviously wrong, right? So you also got to have an explanation that's able to explain things. So when it comes to the question of God, then we want to argue that God fulfills some of these criteria. So people who are familiar maybe with Joshua Rasmussen's book, Joshua Rasmussen gives several arguments for thinking that there has to be a foundation for reality. And then he gives reasons for thinking that this is God, that God is a simple, unified explanation for reality, right? Because if you say, well, the natural world, that's just, every atom that exists, it's just necessary. Well, that's very complicated, right? Like how many atoms exist in the universe, and why is it exactly that number, right? Like, couldn't there have been one more or one less? So we've got a whole lot that's just not explained. Whereas if we say that there's one singular God who upholds everything, then we've got a much simpler explanation. Explanatory power, right, would say that God has like the ability to explain something like consciousness, for example, something like the particular fine-tuning of the universe, something like the biological complexity of life. So we'd say that God has explanatory power, and he's simple. So you're usually going to be appealing to these different criteria of a best explanation, and then showing how God fulfills those better than a rival hypothesis. And sometimes God won't fulfill them as well as another explanation. And so sometimes you have to go to another argument. And so you have to sometimes bring a few different arguments in to get it to God, because maybe you've got a natural explanation that works here, but it won't work for this argument, right? So sometimes you can only get some attributes of God out of a particular argument, and so you have to bring a few together. So it depends on the kind of argument you're using.
So whenever you're talking about giving an explanation or saying that God's an explanation, what would you say to people? I know that T-Jump puts this forward, in that you could really have. So the phenomena in this instance is the universe, right? Like most would agree that it exists, and we're arguing from that to something. He says, yeah, well, anyone could really ad hoc just say, oh, well, you create some imaginable being, and of course it's going to explain it. I mean, you could say that. He always uses like a spaghetti monster can explain it just as well as God can. Like if we're just making up stuff to explain it, then it's not really an explanation. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so the point is then, if say it's like the Kalam argument, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, if T-Jump is granting us that argument, then it's just a question of what is the cause. So it sounds like he wants to talk about the nature of the cause. So that's not actually disputing the argument. Like the Kalam argument, that actually grants it. So then it's a question of what's the best explanation of that cause. Now, notice that actually grants a good amount to us, right? Like if you grant me that there's a cause of the universe, I'm happy with that, because that's all the Kalam is supposed to get me. The question is just what's the best explanation. So, a flying spaghetti monster, you try to parse out what that might be. Is that something that's made out of matter? Presumably it would have to be, right? It's got to be made out of spaghetti, otherwise it doesn't make sense to call it the flying spaghetti monster. Well, we know, for example, that time, space, and matter they all depend on each other for their existence. So you couldn't have something that's material that exists without space and matter. But if we're saying that the universe that began to exist, that includes space, time, and matter that are all contingent on each other, then you can't just say, oh, well, I had a material thing that existed outside of that. You can't have that if you've got to have them all together. So what I would want to say to that then is that it's not a coherent idea. You can't have something that's material being the cause of the origin of matter. So, it's going to depend on what hypothesis they bring forward, but then you just compare it to God and say, can it explain this data as well? And by the way, if it can, because maybe you could appeal to something else that would be the cause of the universe. Maybe you could appeal to some kind of unconscious first cause of the universe. We could just grant that, and maybe other arguments will rule that out, right? If you want to say it's not an intelligent cause of the universe, right? There's a cause of the universe, but it's not intelligent. well, then we can appeal to something like fine-tuning or intelligent design arguments, something that would, show that it has to also be intelligent. So it's got to be a mind. We can appeal to arguments from consciousness to show that it also has to be conscious. Now, he could come up with a different explanation, right, for each and every one of those. But then notice how complicated that is. That's like he has to come up with an explanation for the origin of the universe, origin of fine-tuning, origin of life, complexity of life, and consciousness. That's 5 different explanations he has to have. We can answer all those questions with just one explanation. So simplicity, again, God becomes a simpler explanation. So it usually comes back to just appealing to these kinds of criteria of best explanations.
So speaking on saying that a simple argument, like if you have 2 options, right? One argument, one hypothesis that has it's more of a complex explanation, and then you have one that explains it as well. That's simpler. Why is it best to go with the simpler one? I know you alluded to it just a little bit, but if you could explain that more, I feel like that'd be helpful.
Sure, just because there are fewer ways that it can go wrong. So again, think of the explanation of the burglars coming in through the window to take the pile of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can explain it just by one burglar coming in to take the whole stack, why say that there were 100, right? Because now you've got 100 different ways that can go wrong. Whereas on the first explanation, there's only one way it could go wrong.
So would you also say it's more likely a little bit that the simpler one makes more sense? Because obviously 100 people really could have came in. So how do you differentiate? Like, is it because it's more likely that only one burglar came in and took all $100? I know there's less room for it to go wrong, but it could be the case that 100. I don't know if I'm overcomplicating it, but I'm just
no. What you're drawing out here is the fact that these appealing to these criteria don't get us absolute certainty. And you're right, we're not going to have absolute certainty. That's why we're appealing to the best explanation. We're saying, yeah, we've got 100 possible explanations, right? Could have been one burglar who took it all. Could have been 2 burglars, each one took $50, or you could even divide it up differently than that. Could have been 3 burglars and they split it 3 ways, right? So it could be any of those hypotheses. So we're saying they're all possible, but we want to know what's the best one. What's the best hypothesis out of all the possible hypotheses? And it's going to be the simpler one is going to be best just because it has less built into it. There are fewer ways it can go wrong. And so that makes it intrinsically more probable than any other explanation. And so the most reasonable thing to do is to believe what is most probable, because when you can't have certainty, there are some things we can be certain of, right? Like I'm directly aware of the blue book. I'm certain of that. But there are things we can't be certain of. And so when we're trying to, make an inference to something, that's the best explanation, then we just have to go with probability. And if somebody's not comfortable with that, just think most of what we know is probable, right? Like if you've seen the Matrix films, it's possible you're in the Matrix, right? It's possible that like your parents aren't really your parents and that you were adopted or something. Like pretty much anything is possible. Possibility just comes really cheap. So it is possible that 100 burglars stole the money, but it's not very likely. We've got a much better explanation, a much simpler explanation, and just saying that one burglar did it. And so that's why it's considered a better explanation and therefore intrinsically more probable. But yes, it doesn't erase the possibility that there could have been 100 burglars.
So one thing I think would be really helpful, we kind of touched on justified true belief. I think it would be good for us to break down individually. So how do we know that we've gotten to justification? By that I mean we have something that we believe, and let's just say it's true, but what would count as justification for that? And is there because you could just say, well, that's not a justification for so how do you differentiate between something that counts as a justification and one that doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what is it that makes something justified? And in fact, there are some philosophers who just will want to say that you don't even need justification at all, right? Like Alvin Plantinga, he says justification is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowledge. So maybe I should touch on this debate. There's a debate in epistemology between what's called internalism and externalism. So basically the difference or the issue of that debate is, where is the justification for your beliefs? So the internalist, my position is that justification, it's internal to you. So it's something that in some sense is accessible to you. So if I want to, have a justified belief about God's existence, then the justification for that, I've got to have access to it. The externalist says, no, you don't. It can be outside of yourself. You don't have to have any kind of awareness of that justification. And so that's a debate that goes on. And so the externalists are going to want to say, justification, you don't have to have it as long as it's there, right? So maybe think of it this way. Say that there's a really good argument for God's existence. It's a great, let's say it's a proof even. It's such a strong argument. It completely proves that God exists. But let's also say you've got no awareness of it. You don't even know this argument exists, but you believe that God exists. Well, according to the externalist, it seems like that argument could kind of justify your belief. Now, it's not quite that silly. It's not quite silly, but the idea is that the justification for the belief, you don't have to have any awareness of it as long as it's there. And so normally that's cashed out in terms of appealing to reliable processes. So they'd be like, oh, well, if your brain is functioning properly, if your eyes are functioning properly, if your ears are functioning properly, as long as that is objectively the case, then the beliefs that they're giving you, they're warranted, and you don't have to look for any explanation beyond that. Internalists like myself are kind of not satisfied with that, because it doesn't leave you with any way to differentiate between just a random hunch and something that you actually see. It seems like there's a difference there, right? Like if I'm visually perceiving something versus I've got a random hunch that Joe Biden is going to get elected for 3 consecutive terms, right? It seems like there's a difference in the justification for those beliefs. So justification, but what is it, right? So broadly, it's just a reason for thinking that something is true. So I'm a foundationalist, so I think that we've got 2 types of knowledge, and so therefore 2 types of justification. So you've got your non-inferential beliefs; those are like the foundational beliefs, and as I said, I think those are justified through just a direct awareness of something. So that's how you're justified in those beliefs. Then from those beliefs, you can make inferences to other beliefs, right? So I have a perception that there's a blue book in front of me, and I can make an inference from that. Like, what's the best explanation for that I see a blue book? The best explanation is that there's really a blue book there, right? It's possible I'm hallucinating, possible I'm dreaming, right? So I'm not ruling those out, but the best explanation is that it's really there. So I make an inference then from that I see something to that it's really there. And then if we've got that these are really there, then, we can learn that maybe I'm having a conversation with Jaden right now. So the best explanation is that there really is this guy named Jaden. And then let's say that, you tell me what year you were born, right? And so then I can, make a belief that, if I know you to be a reliable person, then I can say that, yeah, he's probably right. And so that's how knowledge moves up, right? We get beliefs from our direct awareness, we make inferences to that there's a real world. And then based on that real world, we can make inferences from, what people tell us. We can make inferences just from basic logical deductions. And I think we can get all the way from the ground up to the existence of God. So I don't, argue that we have to presuppose it or something like that. So that's my own view, and hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. So when we're talking about justification, I know you said that you believe that there's 2 types of justification. We talked about that at the beginning. Now, something that I was wondering while you're bringing that up is, yes, some justification may be personal, and by their direct awareness, right? Like I have a awareness that you don't have right now, right? But other than that, other than direct personal, where I have private special access that you can't have, is justification besides that? Is it something that I could argue from to show someone else? by that I mean, is it something concrete that we both can point to and actually have a intellectual conversation, and not just saying, well, I have a justification, you have a justification. Like, is justification universal? A little bit is what I'm trying to ask. And maybe
Right.
asking the wrong question, I don't know, but
No, you are. And this is actually something I was thinking about today. So there is a distinction between private justification and public justification. So it seems pretty evident that there are some beliefs that only you are going to be justified in believing in a private way, right? So if you've got a headache at the moment, right, say that you did, I wouldn't be able to know that in the sort of way that you do, right? You could tell me that you had a headache, right? And maybe you could like be holding your head and complaining about it. I'd have some evidence that you had a headache, but like you could always be trying to fool me, right? I wouldn't have the sort of justification that you had, right? Or I know, what color my mom's hair is, right? You've never met my mom, so so like I could tell you that, but you don't have that sort of justification that I have. So there is private justification which you can tell people about, but you can't make them believe you. And so what that means, I think, is that everything really does reduce to the first person. And so justification is ultimately something that's relative to the person. So I could be justified in believing something which you would not be justified in believing, right? Because it's going to be based on the evidence that I have available to me. And so maybe the evidence I have will be available or will justify some belief for me, but you wouldn't have access to that evidence. So of course you wouldn't be justified in holding that belief. But there are public forms of evidence, right? So kind of once we get beyond our own direct awarenesses, right? Let's say we've made the inference from our own direct awarenesses to, there's a real world out there, and that we can interact with people. Okay, so once we're at that level, then when we're not appealing to something that just has to be directly aware of, something that we can show other people, when we've got that kind of base level of agreement, then we're at the level of public justification. And so that's normally where I like to go with my own apologetic to, argue for God's existence, because that's the least controversial stuff. I don't have to appeal to like a personal experience or something that's like the other person has no access to. I can point you to the evidence of the beginning of a universe, right? And you can verify that, just by looking through a telescope and seeing the expansion of the universe. I can point you to the evidence of design in DNA, right? You can go right into the microscope and access the information that's in the genetic code. So publicly accessible evidence is great, but ultimately we get there on the basis of private evidence. So it does come to that, like you get so far with public evidence, and so that's good stuff, because it's people don't just have to say, oh well, I can reject your experience. But ultimately, if somebody wants to like be like, I don't believe that, that doesn't mean that you aren't privately justified in believing this as well. So hopefully that makes sense, that there is a distinction between private evidence and public evidence.
And whenever you were talking about it's internalist and externalist, right? Whenever you're talking about that, I think there's an article I read that you wrote. I forget what specifically it was about, but pretty much you were addressing certain Christians who used a specific verse that talked about how pretty much that engaging in epistemology is not a virtue. It's actually something that we shouldn't do. And I know a lot of presuppositionalists will allude to that as well. But what would you say to someone who would say that, let's say you tell someone, this is a good example, just tell someone, I believe in God, and they ask why. And then you quote a Bible verse. Why should we go any further to try to actually engage? Like, why is it even something that we should, why don't we just quote a Bible verse and run? Pretty much what I'm asking. Like, why is it worth sitting there and actually engaging with them? I know that 1 Peter 3:15, is a call for us to stay, but there's a lot of people who would ignore that. But I know you touched on this in your article. I bet you don't know which one I'm alluding to because you've written a lot of them. But do you kind of get what I'm asking? Like, why is it? Before we talked about why it's practical, but now why should we even engage in it? Like, why is it a good thing we actually try to answer someone's objection and not just quote them a Bible verse?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of maybe two questions there. So there's the question of like people go to like I think it's Colossians 2:10, right, where it says
Yeah, I think it's
beware unless anyone spoils you through philosophy or vain
vain
deceit.
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think this is the only time that the word philosophy appears in the New Testament, at least in
Yeah.
the King James. And so some Christians will go there and be like, see, as Christians, we're supposed to beware of philosophy. So you don't want that philosophy. And it's funny is that's a misreading of the verse. He doesn't
Yeah.
say beware of philosophy. He says beware unless
Of
anyone
vain.
spoils
Yeah.
you. So it's actually a warning of, and like the spoiling there is not.
Yeah.
It's not like when your milk has been in the it's been sitting out on the counter too long. Spoiling there refers to being captured. So it's like spoils of war. That's the idea of the word there. In fact, a lot of other translations would just say beware of being captured by philosophy. And so the warning there is not against philosophy. It's a warning against being captured by philosophy. And it's against being captured by a very specific type of philosophy. And that's philosophy that is vain. That's empty philosophy. Philosophy that is after the rudiments of the world, after the traditions of men, and not after Christ. Mm-hmm. So what he's saying is don't be captured by philosophy that's not after Christ. Now, if there's a philosophy that is not after Christ, that means that there must be a philosophy that is after Christ. Yeah. C.S. Lewis once said that good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than because bad philosophy needs to be answered. And that's very much what I think that Paul is saying in Colossians there. He's saying that beware of being captured through bad philosophy. And if you want to be really beware of being caught by the enemy, you need to know the enemy. And so I think this is actually an implicit exhortation for Christians to be well versed in good philosophy so that we can know how to answer the bad philosophy with gentleness and respect. And so I don't think that is it. But why can't we, like, isn't the word of God powerful enough? Why can't we just quote Bible verses as skeptics? Well, the problem is when you invoke the Bible, and usually when people are just quoting the Bible, they're doing it as though the Bible has the authority of God behind it. Now, I believe that the Bible does have the authority of God behind it. But if someone tells me they don't believe in God, I can't say, oh, well, God says he exists, right? Because then I'm engaging in a circle, right? They don't believe that God exists. So if I'm saying, oh, well, I know that God exists because he said so, look right here, I'm invoking a premise in an argument that they reject, right? In other words, I'm using my conclusion that God exists to prove that God exists, right? If I said, why do you believe that God exists? And you said, because God exists, then that's a circular argument and it's not actually getting them anywhere. So I'm happy to quote a Bible verse to someone who accepts that the Bible is true, but I can't quote the Bible authoritatively to someone who does not acknowledge that it has any authority to begin with. And so that's, again, why it's helpful to really like go down to what does the other person accept, right? If they accept science, we can give scientific arguments for God's existence. If they believe in history, we can give historical arguments for the resurrection of Christ. And so what we're trying to point them back to Scripture, like that's where we want to get them. But if you start with your conclusion, again, you're going to be begging the question, you're going to be engaging in circular reasoning. And of course, that won't be convincing or persuasive to the person you're talking to.
Yeah, that's great. I couldn't have said it any better. I remember you reminded me, like, whenever you said when we quote Bible verses, we're quoting it with God's authority behind it. But if they don't believe in God, I remember hearing Eric Hernandez say it's like using a comic book to prove Superman's existence. If they don't believe the comic books, telling us, the nature of reality, how it is, then it's not going to do any good. So that's good that you distinguish that. There's something else I was going to. So we're talking about specifically about, we kind of touched on like the presuppositionalist point of view a little bit. And if you want, you can allude to that more because I know you love dealing with presuppositionalists. So go ahead and do that a little bit if you would. Just talk about what that viewpoint is and why you personally think it falls short of. I know it's an epistemic point of view, but and you would disagree with this, so just kind of allude to that a little bit and explain that.
Presuppositional apologetics. It's important to remember, of course, that there's not just one type of presuppositionalism. So, like, even within presuppositionalism, you've got like people who follow Cornelius Van Til, and they're known as the Van Tillians. But you've also got people who follow Francis Schaeffer, and they're the Schaefferians. You've got followers of Gordon Clark, and they're the Clarkians. So, even within presuppositional apologetics, there is some variety. The most popular kind of presuppositionalism, and in my personal opinion, the most annoying kind, is Van Tillian presuppositionalism. And this is like hugely popular in Calvinist circles for some reason, I guess because Van Til is a Calvinist and was quite successful in convincing a lot of people that in order to be consistent with the Calvinist idea of total depravity, then you had to be a presuppositionalist, which is quite honestly not true. But you know, that whole issue aside, why is it an inadequate apologetic? Or rather, before I say it's inadequate, maybe I should say what it is. So the idea here is that they don't like what they call autonomous reasoning. So they kind of would reject the whole idea that I presented before, that we could kind of have individual items of knowledge based on a direct awareness of those things and kind of build a whole, you know, proverbial building of knowledge just from the ground up. They say, nope, can't do that. So instead, they say everyone, you presuppose a worldview. So they say everything, you know, I'm a Christian, so I'm presupposing the Christian worldview. Atheists are going to presuppose an atheist worldview. Buddhists will presuppose a Buddhist worldview. And then we can't, you know, obviously, I can't as a Christian critique Islam, right? Because Muslims, they've got different presuppositions than me. So I can't. So instead, I've got to, you know, hypothetically act like, well, let's pretend Islam is true. Let's act like if Islam were true, and let's see, is it internally consistent? And then they'll point out, oh, well, there's contradictions in the Quran, so Muslim worldview, it's no good. What about the atheist worldview? Oh, well, you know, there's problems in that worldview. And so they'll say only the Christian worldview is internally coherent and can account for what they want to call preconditions of intelligibility. And what they mean by that is usually the laws of logic and induction. You know, and induction is just basically the idea that the future is going to be like the past. So that if I make an inference that, like, you know, the sun has risen every day in the past, then it's going to rise tomorrow. On that basis, that's an inductive inference. And so those are kind of their two big points. And they'll say only Christianity, you know, gives you a robust worldview to do that. I oppose that whole way of looking at things. I think that's a bad way to look at competing worldviews. But, you know, so that's important. That's why they don't want to like focus on individual arguments for God's existence, right? Because they'll say, oh, well, you know, if you're making an argument like the Kalam cosmological argument, it presupposes something like causation. But we can only make sense of causation in the Christian worldview. So, you know, the atheist is just going to reject those presuppositions. So it's pointless. So they don't like to like focus on individual things. They say the only way you can do it is by a whole worldview. The question I will always want to ask is, why do you think we have to do it that way? You know, why do you think we have to just presuppose an entire worldview? Like that, I don't see any good reason for doing that. I mean, and why does it have to be like, why would we assume that one of the existing worldviews is just going to be the right one? I mean, just because there's no internal contradictions in a worldview, that doesn't mean it's correct. Just because you can account for something in a worldview, it doesn't mean it's correct. Maybe the correct worldview is one that we haven't even discovered, you know? So, like, I just don't see that doesn't seem like a good way of approaching it. And so I want to know, like, why is it that you're rejecting the method that I'm proposing, which is that we can, you know things directly and we can build our way up from there to God. And what they do then is, you know, they'll try to bring in like traditional problems of philosophy. So they'll be like, oh, well, you've got the problem of induction. Oh, well, you've got like the problem of justifying logical laws. And, these are real problems that philosophers deal with. And of course, anyone who wants to see how I deal with those problems, I'll just point you to a video that I did called What's Wrong with Presuppositional Apologetics.
I'll be linking your channel in the description so they can click that nail. So just letting everyone know, if you want to find his channel, it'll be in the description.
All right. Yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, so it's like an hour-long video, and I went to town on how I think we can resolve these problems. So if those problems can be resolved, then we don't really have any motivation for kind of doing this like worldview way of looking at things, like everything is its own bubble. That's a very strange way of doing it to me, and I don't think it actually works. And so as long as we can solve the problems that they're raising, then kind of the more classical or evidential methods of apologetics, those are fine.
So question I have, so the presuppositionalist, when do they do they think that everyone's just like intuitively, like just like, or subconsciously just pick a worldview? Like when do you obviously, would you say a baby has a worldview, and like at what point do you pick it? And the question is, when you pick it, do you just kind of pick and guess, and then or you just happen to have a worldview and then you try to argue from that? And if not, then how do you decide which worldview to go with? And at that point, you're kind of stepping outside the bounds of presuppositionalism, aren't you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Presuppositionalists may have to give you the answer to that, because I've heard kind of different answers to that. So they'll be like, everyone has a worldview, even if they don't know it. But then I've also heard some of them say, well, of course, a baby doesn't have a worldview, but Yeah.
So at what point, and the point you do decide, whatever tools you use to decide it, then you can just use that either way. So it's kind of self-defeating a little bit, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding it. I'll have to ask the presuppositionalist.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm guessing is that they would want to say is they say it doesn't matter how they get there. Eventually, they're going to have a worldview, no matter what. And so, at the point that they do, you just show them that the Christian worldview accounts for it. Or maybe they would say, if a person, claims to not have a worldview, then we're just going to bring out things like induction and laws of logic and show them that only the Christian worldview accounts for those things. So that's why you should pick the Christian worldview. So maybe it's like they do leave themselves with some kind of tools for assessing worldviews by saying that non-Christian worldviews are self-contradictory or don't account for specific items of human experience. So it's not like they leave themselves with no tools. I don't think they leave themselves with adequate tools.
So right now we're at like the 52-minute mark, so I won't keep you too long. But one thing I will ask, I mean, maybe I should address this in the beginning. It would have been more beneficial. But either way, so how did you start getting into epistemology, and what made you first interested in it, and how did you, from that point, how did you go that route? I know I asked you personally because I'm personally at that stage, but go ahead.
Yeah. So let's see. Probably it began when I started reading a lot of Norman Geisler books. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Norman Geisler, but he was huge for me. So before I discovered his work, I was pretty much only been exposed to Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis, and that was the extent of my apologetics. But I read this book called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist" by Norman Geisler. Frank Turek, yeah.
Oh, okay. So now I'm making the connection. I've heard it before. I've heard Norman Geisler. I'm familiar with Frank Turek. I'm familiar with both, but I'm more familiar with Frank Turek. But.
Yeah. They both co-authored that book. Yeah. That was also my introduction to Turek's work. And so I really liked that book, and so then I was buying up everything I could from Norman Geisler. And kind of his magnum opus was this book called Christian Apologetics, which is it's a really big. It's his 3-stage argument for Christianity.
And how would you compare that book to William Lane Craig's Apologetics book? Because I think now his older book is just an introduction, like Christian Apologetics, an introduction. And then I think now he kind of he uses a lot of the same material and reasonable faith. So how would you, just for the audience, how would you compare William Lane Craig's book to Norman Geisler's? Which one do you prefer? I know I'm kind of sidetracking you, but
no, that's good. It depends on what you want it for. So I would say it's comparable to William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith.
Yeah.
So it's not if you're not used to reading apologetics or philosophy, then might not be the best introduction for you. You might want to start with more like, for William Lane Craig, a book like On Guard, or for Geisler, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Those are kind of the introductory books. But when you're ready to go up a level, then William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith is kind of like that intermediate book between his popular books and his academic books. I would put Geisler's book kind of in that category. It has similar arguments, but Geisler had his own way of arguing for them. But the first third of that book is kind of just dedicated to establishing a method of knowledge. And so that's kind of what got me into it. Geisler had kind of an idiosyncratic version of foundationalism. I held to it for a while, but eventually I still held the foundationalist picture, so that remained, but I did reject Geisler's particular account of how we justify very foundational beliefs. But that's kind of where my interest in it began. And then I was good for a while, but then I ran into presuppositionalists, and they started like questioning me at another level. Like the answers that I thought I had to how I knew things, that wasn't good enough for the presuppositionalists. They were like, no, that doesn't work because of this, this, and this. So perhaps ironically enough, even as much as I fight against presuppositionalism, I probably owe them a lot, because their constant questions and their constant how do you knows that drove me like to go as deep as I could go on that issue. But I would say it was probably due to Geisler's influence that I developed an interest in it.
One question I have, which I know for me, I'm kind of this way. So let's say that there's all sorts of different views specifically in the field of epistemology, and you said that you kind of changed from Geisler's foundationalism to like another view of foundationalism. So how do you like realize, okay, like I'm more convinced by this view and I'm gonna hold to that? Like, because for me, I don't know, maybe which this is probably not good, but I'm always like, but what if there's like one more response that will keep that will, because it's not that I don't want to leave it, but I'm afraid like I'll step into the wrong field, and I want to be like, obviously there's no way we could practically have certainty, but how do you go about like assessing your views and take introspection and then considering another position?
I mean, I would say be honest with yourself with like what's presently available to you. So if you've got a position that that seems good to you, remember that justification is relative to the person. So like if you've got based on what you currently know, some particular view that's the best you've got, hold on to it, but maybe kind of tentatively. One thing that's going to that gives a person confidence is as you become familiar with the territory. And this is going to happen, no matter what field you look into. So epistemology is no different, but I become a lot more confident in my particular version of foundationalism when I read the critics of it, and I think I have good answers to the sorts of arguments they're giving. And there's really no easy way to do that. It's just it's in the details. It's hard.
Seems just like having a well-rounded bedrock of knowledge to
I mean, again, there's no substitute for working through the details. Some of the questions in epistemology are some of the hardest ones that are out there. I still wrestle with questions in epistemology all the time. I've got a basic framework, but I mean, I haven't mastered it all, and I don't think I'm ever going to. So it's just there's a saying that familiarity breeds calm. So when you become really familiar with an area, then you'll just basically start to know the objections to your view and why you think they don't work, and that should give you a level of confidence.
And that's kind of where I'm at, like for those viewing, like maybe even on my channel, my YouTube channel, like after this is like the live stream's ended and it's published, for me, I'm at that stage where I'm like starting to dip my toes in some of like the deeper stuff like epistemology and all that stuff, because I'm really well versed in theology, like because I've studied that like most of my life, and I feel very comfortable in that, and I'm confident in my positions. But now I'm stepping out. I guess the same principle would apply, but you brought that up, and that breeds confidence, which is great. And like I said, that's why I had David on, because David's very well versed in epistemology, and also David's a big friend of mine. Like he's become a good friend of mine. He's a big help with me get into that. He's kind of like I'm trying to think of a way. You're kind of like helping me along the way, like a little bit to get there. So I appreciate that. And I think that actually fits well with the whole like vision or purpose of the channel is to help give you Christians confidence in your faith, so you can, and part of that's familiarity. So it's always good to study. It says to study to show thyself approved. So that's a good point that David brought up. So I think we can go ahead and end it there. I know I appreciate your time, so I don't want to keep you too long. I'm sure I'll probably go pick up another epistemology book and read it by the time I finish mine. He reads so fast, and like I need to work on that. But yeah, so thanks for coming on, David. I appreciate it. Glad you came on. I'd love to have you on another time. Who knows, maybe I could host a debate between you and a presuppositionalist. It's always good to have a couple dumpster fires. Anyway, yeah, so thanks for coming on. I hope we can do it another time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.